people can speak up. You can welcome to unmute and talk. We can chat and answer any questions. I see some in the chat as well. I'll take a look at those while we're on break.
David, I saw something in the chat about somebody commenting about all the numbers might not make sense to people who think that the economy is bad. So that's a perception. Is there any way that we can counteract a perception? Because we have to figure out how to get over that.
I battle with media people. Like, I follow a lot of reporters, economics reporters, all the big names from the Washington Post, the New York Times, to a lesser extent, the Wall Street Journal. And I whenever I see misleading articles, which they do all the time, I hit them with it. And sometimes they'll engage with me and sometimes they won't. It depends. But it is as simple. If somebody is saying something, and this was in the chat too, if somebody's saying the price of eggs are up, or the price of gas is up, or this or that is up, they're talking about the cost, but there's also income. And talking about costs without talking about income is irrational, meaning they're emotional. They want to complain about, oh, I hate paying all this extra money for gas. It's like, well, the world changed during the pandemic, and you also have, on average, most workers have a lot more pocket money. They've got, as I mentioned, $1 an hour more in real terms, meaning after discounting and hitting them for inflation, they still have more money, about $1,000 per worker. So workers are better off now than pre-pandemic. And we have to explain that. And one of the things that keeps coming up, it makes it so challenging being on the liberal side, is it's always simpler to say, I'm just going to give you tax cuts. When you're the Republican president or a candidate, you say, I'm just cutting taxes. Everybody knows what that is. But if you're a Democrat and you have a 10-point plan to improve the healthcare system, it's complicated and hard to sell. And so it's a miracle that we got the Affordable Care Act through. But there is complexity that has to be explained, and it has to be explained by a very energetic communicator that is willing to say this stuff over and over and over again. And that's where Biden can improve, I think, what he's doing. He's got some bad advice, I think, from some people that work for him, where he's not allowed to brag about the economy because some people are hurting. Well, the vast majority are doing extremely well, or we wouldn't be seeing this boom. And so you can say, we have an awesome economy, and I'm doing these things to help you. We can walk and chew gum. But people that are complaining about prices, they need to be reminded that that's just one side of the equation. Their wages are also up. And it's even for retired persons, they got big COLAs from Social Security. And retired people are in a much different position, where about 80% of the elderly in the U.S. live in a household. They own the home. But I mean, there are these. So the elderly folks should be doing very well as well. I don't think the COLA's quite been as big as inflation, but they're not that different. And because of the home ownership as a group, the elderly have weathered this extremely well, because they have the giant housing price increases and can extract equity if they need to. So all the groups are doing fine. And, you just have to battle it out by saying, you're just talking about costs. Your incomes are up more. It's that simple. And they don't want to hear it. And that's why the media narrative about real wages are down under Biden is so devastating. That is killing that argument. And that's what we got to stop, is they got to stop talking about real wages against when Biden started. When people say that, I say, yeah, but 14, if you're going to use that bad number, and I explain it to them, 14 million people more are working right now. I mean, you can't just cherry pick and say, well, the real wages are down from, 2021, when 14 million people more are working. Give Biden credit where it's due. So it's just this ongoing battle of the Fox News and the Republicans have put certain talking points into their area. They've repeated it over and over again, and the Democrats just don't know how to do that. There is not a standard set of slides from, I always say this, from Biden that explains this stuff so that it's shared on all these sites and all the different politicians share it. It's all these different politicians create their own slides, and it's just devastating. They're so much better organized on the Republican side. We need a marketing department terribly.
Yeah, well,
Carl and I can only do so much.
You look at all the media and how much of the media is owned by the right, and so once you look at that, you can understand why. And there is when they say there's a liberal bias in the media, that's a talking point. It's a distraction, because the media is actually biased to the right.
Thank you for saying that. That is something that is not said enough. And, Fox News has a massive footprint, way bigger than MSNBC.
Yep.
And so the idea that the media is biased when you got Fox News in your corner is sort of like, I mean, come on, really? I mean, it's a ridiculous talking point, but people believe it. And, I mean, there's so many elements to it, but there is such a strong propaganda effort on the Republican side. I mean, Republicans, we've talked about this many times, they poll better than Democrats on the economy. And it's not close. Like, they blow away the Democrats when they are polled. And the data tells you the opposite, that the Democrats do far better on the economy, and it's not close. But Republicans have repeated the same talking point and have convinced people that Trump is an economic genius, and that the economy, you want a good economy, you want to hire Republicans, and it's just the opposite. Carl talked about the 10 of 11 recession starting under Republicans.
David, just a few notes here. Ann Reisner has asked if she could make some comments. She can't get off mute. I think Christine will probably have to do that.
Oh, she's blocked. All right.
Okay.
You're welcome. Make as many points as you like. We have we do enough.
And then the other thing is, a lot of people joined later on, and they probably missed the first few slides that Carl had on the jobs growth, etc. So at some point later on, you may want to revisit those first few slides. And the third point I just want to make is, in Iowa, the number one item that was on everybody's mind when they did their pre-polling last night was the economy. So I think some of these comments on chat are very, very, very timely. So thank you.
No, I'm
glad
for
addressing those.
Yeah, we want people to bring up the questions, and it makes it a lot more fun, actually, for Carl and I. As much fun as these slides are to go through. I mean, they're there for you. You got a month to digest them. The year in review stuff isn't really going to change. I mean, there'll be minor revisions to those numbers, but they don't drastically change. I mean, it includes 2023. 2023 was a fantastic year. Yeah, I mean, it's our leadership has to take pride in their numbers. The 2023 numbers are better than 2019, even adjusted for inflation. We've got a slide at the end that summarizes that, puts them right next to each other so you can see it. I've been sharing that thing all over Twitter, and a couple of times some famous people with big followings have spread them around. And it's just a question of trying to get that stuff into the minds of at least Democratic voters. They are energized by it. I don't know that you're going to change a MAGA brain, but you can get somebody that's like, Biden's done okay, but I'm not thrilled with what he did. And you can say, hey, look at this. There's a lot of good news, and maybe we'll recap it at some point. But you've got 4 very major pieces of legislation that Biden passed. The Rescue Act, you had the Infrastructure Act, you had the Inflation Reduction Act, which sadly that it's named that, but it's a huge climate bill. Also raised taxes on corporations and put in a stock buyback tax, which nobody really knows about, but it actually passed. Stock buybacks finally. And then the last one is the CHIPS and Science Act, which is defending our semiconductor industry because we can't really afford the big disruptions. It's kind of like, in a way, semiconductors are like the new oil, and you don't want to be embargoed by China if they take over Taiwan. You don't want to be a massive disruption like that. So it was an important national security bill, not just an economic bill. 4 big pieces of legislation, all before Republicans got in where they were able to block it. And, I'm looking forward to Biden, the combative Biden, taking pride in what he did and all the good stuff he's done, and just slamming Republicans, saying, you guys are blocking the next round of this. And it is. I mean, Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema get all the bad rap for blocking this stuff, but really they're only 2 Democrats. There were 50th Republican senators that were blocking this stuff, and they got a pass to a large extent. People, we didn't get this child tax credit because of Republicans, not because of Manchin. So we just have to get a lot better with our messaging and just stop being punching bags for the right. And people just not used to it. We're too nice most of the time. Let me take a look at the chat too. Now, when I generalize about the media, I'm talking about economic the major economic journals, the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal are sort of the core. When I say the media, that's what I mean. So it's a good point that there's Fox News, there's CNN, there's others, but I mean I would say the experts are in those three places. They are the ones that are doing a really bad job, with the exception of Paul Krugman. I think the other people are doing a horrible job explaining the economy, and and I've had back and forth with some of them. They don't care about the proper way to explain things in context. They just want, and it's a lot more negative. Negative news gets more clicks than positive news. One thing that Trump, let's give him credit, Trump called the 2018 and 19 economies the greatest ever. He was using that language again just recently, and I will show you absolute proof that 2023 was better than 2019. You'll have it, and we just got to argue it. Let's make the argument. All right, I think, let's see here. Let me, I've been sharing my screen, so I can't see all the faces out there, but Bill had brought up a point of kind of revisiting a couple of things. And for time, what I'd like to do is just focus on this slide regarding the employment, because I think this is the most important one. The job creation is probably the single most important economic statistic there is. There's all kinds of other ones, but this is where the tire hits the road. If you are creating jobs, you have a growing economy, everything else is going well. And if jobs are crashing and things are bad, then things are going bad in the economy. So right now, if you look at Biden from inauguration, he's creating an average of 400,000 and 408,000 jobs per month. If you start counting from 2020, when the pre-pandemic peak was regained, so if you discount all that extra work, all those jobs in the first part, you wait until the economy had recovered, at least on the job total, to the pre-pandemic level, and you start counting from there, you've got 268,000 a month in job creation, better than Trump, no matter how you measure Trump. 182,000 pre-pandemic, his best 3-year run, when he will tell you many times the economy was the greatest ever when he had that job creation. And then if you factor in his 4th year, the economy crashed. Now, one interesting thing that the media has done is that Trump gets a mulligan. 2020, the whole pandemic disaster put the economy on its back and blew deficits through the roof. He's not accountable for that. He's Teflon. Those bullets just bounce off him. And I even say, fine, get away with that murder. But even then, 2017 to 2019 is not close to Biden's job creation. And this is the most important measure. Of all these other measures, this one is the one that should carry the most weight. We're in a situation where inflation is carrying the most weight, where that's what the media is covering. And they're covering, again, the cost side without covering the income side. And so they are just catering to angry people, upset that gas prices are this or egg prices are that. And it's like, oh, yeah, it's terrible. And it's like, well, I got wages that outgrew inflation. So what are you crying about? Nobody wants to confront them and say, you're a bunch of crybabies. And we probably should. To some extent, Biden maybe not, but his proxies should be like, listen, you got to grow up. The income's higher than inflation, and you're in a better place now than you were when Trump was saying everything was the greatest ever, and let them scream. But that's the main slide. We're going to go through the income and inflation here in a minute, but this slide is the one that tells the story about how strong the economy is. And this is a sucker that I am going to be putting in everybody's face. This is a great slide that explains just how much better Biden is than Trump. And we just got to keep at it. We covered the unemployment rate and some other statistics that are in here, but that's the one that in the labor market, it's the job creation. That's the big one. The unemployment rate was fantastic. Hit that one real quick. That's a good piece of news there. Maybe we took it out. No, it's here it is. So the unemployment rate in both 2022 and 2023 on average was 3.6. Some here 2019 at 3.7. You have to go all the way back to 1969 for a 3.5 year. This is extremely low unemployment, full employment, and then some by most standards, meaning it's such low unemployment that it's actually generating some inflation. There's too many people working, is one way to think about it. But this is a tremendous 2 years, not just 23, but 22 and 23. I can make an easy case that 2022 and 23 both were better than 2019 under Trump very easily. But one thing that happened in 2022 is Americans became the richest ever. The net worth of American people became, in all levels, the bottom 50%, the next 50th to 90th. We shared a slide on net worth. That's the year that everybody became the richest ever because the stock market had not fallen yet. And from its peak, it peaked in late 2021 timeframe. And Americans became the richest ever. How many of you heard Biden say that? Americans, congratulations, you're the richest ever in 2022. I didn't. Crazy not to. Trump would have. He would have been saying it every freaking day in 2022. You're the richest ever, Americans. Boom, every day. And the media would have gone crazy. Oh, yeah, Americans are the richest ever. Look at these 10 graphs. We just don't do that. All right, let's start on the next part. So inflation and wages. We'll move really quickly through some of this because this is old news for most people. So this is the chart of inflation versus the prior month. So how much higher were prices than they were in the prior month? And so for 2 months, October, November, we had no inflation practically, and then it popped back up in December, up to 0.3. And of that 30.3, 0.3 of 1%. Finance people use this term basis points. 100 basis points is 1%. So this 0.3 is 30 basis points. Housing was slightly more than half of that. So rent is really what's driving inflation, and this has been driving inflation for some time. If you are not paying rent, the Fed also uses something where they sort of guess what your inflation would be as a homeowner. And so you can't just say, well, I don't rent, so therefore those costs don't apply to me. But to some extent, if you're not renting, you weren't getting slapped with these big rent increases. The other areas were minor contributors: food, 0.3, all the other stuff, 8. The story lately has been rent's been sort of consistently bad, and then energy, the gas prices have been coming down. This month, the gas prices sort of flattened out a little bit. They didn't keep dropping as far as I can tell. So next, this is the slide versus a year ago. So this shows that if you measure versus a year ago, and this is what the media spends most of its time explaining, if you include all the items, it was 3.4%. So things were 3.4% more expensive than a year ago. And if you take out some things, if you take out the food and energy, it's about 3.9. And that reflects the idea that it isn't food and energy that's really doing it, it's rent these days. Rent is a bigger chunk of this CPI core than it is in the CPI all, because this one's a little more diluted by the food and energy. Here, there's not that much else other than rent. There's fewer other things. When you get into the particular components, all this stuff, June through December, is monthly changes. So how much more expensive was stuff versus the prior month. This part that's boxed in over here is versus a year ago. So you see that 3.4 and the 3.9 that were on the slide. The green means good, meaning the prices are falling versus a year ago. The yellow means they're going up a little bit or mixed. And the red is this shelter, the rent, which continues to be the boogeyman of the inflation measure, accounting for about half of it. That is where the action is. Shelter is weighted very heavily. Not all of these rows are weighted equally. As you can imagine, rent is a bigger chunk of what people spend every month than their car insurance. This one shows kind of over time how the components of inflation have changed. And it's interesting how things have sort of handed off like a relay race. Like, you can see those track and field events, like the 4 runners doing a quarter mile each or a mile each, wherever they do it. This energy was a big deal at first, and the goods down here. So as you had the pandemic, people were buying all this stuff on Amazon. Prices were going up for goods. And people weren't able to go out and shop for services. They needed to get those endorphins somehow, so they bought stuff to feel better. And then that kind of started fading, and energy picked the baton up. And that was where we had the invasion of the Ukraine. gas prices jumped about $1, somewhere like 80, let's say 75 cents to $1 higher than they would have been otherwise. And that was this bump right here in energy. And then energy started to come down and food picked up, and so did services with rent. And that rent has been pretty consistently bad all along. I'm sorry, that's the blue. There's rent expanding, this dark blue here, and continues to be the main chunk of our inflation versus a year ago. Food has become very minor. Services beside housing isn't that big. It's a little bit, but energy has been actually a negative, meaning it's been helping us bringing the prices down. It's really this dark blue, the housing, and then the other services, housing, it's teal color. That's kind of what's hitting us right now. So that's, again, you can see how the components contribute to the total inflation. And, this is the Council on Economic Advisors. Inflation has largely been driven by core services, especially housing. And that's 2.1 percentage points of the 3.1 inflation that they have. Now, a piece of good news is inflation expectations is what investors think the inflation rate is going to be. And we can derive this from bonds that are normal versus inflation protected, otherwise equal. And we see that inflation expectations are right around the Fed's target, around 2%, which is where they want them. And, they're not likely to get down here where they were at the end of the pandemic. That's an unusual reading. 2% is a very good place for inflation expectations. And the good news is the Fed gets this data in the public for everybody every week. So everybody can see it, but the Fed's probably got it even faster. But they've got a good reading on this. That's a really good piece of news. That's the interest rate you hear about. The Fed funds rate is what they control most directly. Let me pause for a second. I'm not looking at the way the screens look when I'm sharing in presentation mode. Anything, Carl, we want to cover?
Somebody pointed to an essay, a column in the New York Times from yesterday about how the economy is in the toilet under Biden, that you and I are going to have to go take a look at and comment on.
Yeah. I saw one from Roger Lowenstein. He's normally he's an author. I've got a couple of his books. I've used them as a reference for a couple of things. He did a lot of research on the Great Recession and then some of the crashes in the stock market. I mean, he's a pretty thorough guy, but if that's the one that people are referring to, it was absolutely terrible in terms of, he was really bad about people are upset, basically saying that their standard of living is falling under Biden because real wages are down slightly from 2021. And he didn't even bother to catch up with the latest net worth data, which is available quarterly now. He was talking about stuff from 2022, saying, well, these big gains in net worth were mainly under Trump. So it was a terrible article. I mean, it was so biased. I just wanted to set it on fire. I was like, you got to be kidding. So that's the one.
Yes, Robert Lowenstein. Yes.
Yeah, that's it. Oh, it was horrible. I was just I was going sentence by sentence, going, you got to be kidding. It was painful to go through that one. So yeah, I read it. I commented on that article, and I basically said, Mr. Lowenstein seems to not understand that there is real net worth data through the third quarter of 2023, and which he didn't mention, which happens to say that people became the richest ever in 2022. He just ignored that and talked about how great the net worth went up under Trump. I mean, this is terrible when you see stuff like that, but this is what we're up against. There is a direct effort to make Trump look like an economic genius, and as Carl and I have been telling this story every month, all through the Biden and through the Trump era and the Biden era. If you look at Trump, his pre-pandemic years were a pretty much straight line continuation of Obama, with slightly slower job creation, as we pointed out. And then when he did the tax cuts, growth probably accelerated a little bit. And so his GDP numbers were a little better than Obama, but his deficits went a lot higher than they were predicted to be if he had not done those tax cuts, which is what always happens with tax cuts. The deficits go up. So, pick your poison there. But people are not, we are going to be up against a very concentrated misinformation campaign painting Trump as an economic genius when A, he inherited a good economy from Obama and then eventually blew it up in 2020. And then B, Biden's economy, now that we've recovered, is better than 2019. And that one thing that gave me some peace of mind was the Treasury. She's a former Fed Vice Chair, Lal Brainard, did a piece that we covered and linked in the last month's presentation. He did it with sort of a recap of 2023, and he was comparing against 2019 pre-pandemic. And so if he knows to do that, he's like he is the closest to Obama. He just needs a much better PowerPoint person to create some beautiful slides for her. And I don't consider our slides beautiful, by the way. I consider them very utilitarian. There are some good marketing people out there that can do wonders with PowerPoint. Put them to work on that stuff. Allow Brainerd come up with the stats he wants. Let those people pretty it up for her, because her piece was very dense. And it went to the media, but they didn't really cover it very much because it would have taken some work for them to use these slides and convert them into something they'd want to publish. So, help them out, people.
I also dropped the link to the weekly gas prices, which, let's see, peaked in August. Most recently, national average of 387, went down to 305 the week before Christmas. But Christmas week, of course, gas prices shot up a little bit to 312, but they're back down to 306. So they basically went down every week except Christmas week.
I mean, gas prices, and when you adjust for inflation, you use a real gas price over time. It's right in the range over the last 20-something years. The gas price is not unusual. It's right near the average. So this is an old Republican talking point that has sort of gone away, but it certainly could come back with some of the geopolitical risk that's out there that Carl mentioned. There's a lot of things that can go wrong in the world in any given year, but we're in a little bit more precarious position now. There's a lot more drama going on in the Middle East than there was, before Hamas attacked Israel and killed all those people. So let's see here. Now, this is a story that is finally getting through. There's a lot of economists are putting this into the articles now. I'm seeing Krugman do it a lot, and he's got a giant platform, so that's really good. Wages have outgrown inflation if you go back to February 20, which was the last pre-pandemic month. You've seen some other comparisons here where we've done annual averages, or in some cases some data is quarterly, but this is sort of the last month that was good before the pandemic started hurting numbers. So it's the best, it's a good month to start. It was Trump's best month, basically. And we can start even from there. Wages are up 22.4%. CPI, all items, up 19.1. CPI core up 17.2. So if you look at that difference between 22.4 and 19.1, that's 3.3%. That's how much real wages are up in February of 2020, the last pre-pandemic month. That's a great news story. And notice those wages have always exceeded the cumulative, if you were tracing that path over time, the wages have always been higher than the CPI number at any given point. So this is a story that is, people get lost in the Biden, things are down from 2021, we've explained over and over again, that isn't the relevant frame. And so 2019 is what the relevant frame is, and that's what we got to get people talking about. This is the much longer view of wages. This is real wages over, all the way back to 64. Real wages are extremely high. As Carl was saying, there was a lot of stuff going on between 1974 and the mid-90s that caused those numbers to fall. Now they've been on a pretty steady increase since then, and are about 97th percentile now in the latest reading, 29.42 per hour in December of 2023. So what you're seeing the media do, and as we shared before, they were beating up on this little drop here in the upper right corner, saying, Biden's doing something wrong because real wages are down. They're not talking about the giant spike from all those people losing their job, or the fact that real wages are incredibly high. And notice that real wages have not gone up throughout our history. There's Carl, there's a lot of things going on that cause real wages to fall for a very long time. Also, fear of union representation falling during that time when Reagan put his union busting didn't help real wages go up to fairly high unemployment compared to where it is now. The thing that drives real wages up is when you've got a tremendous competition for workers. That's what really is making the real wages go up, is when you have low unemployment. That's the key. And we've got really low unemployment now, and real wages are extremely high. This is just my graph out of Fred. Here's what a pro did. This guy, his name is Fred Dubé. He's a professor in economics. Paul Krugman has been amplifying what he's been sharing. He's a wage guru. This is what he studies, and he's got a lot of text in here explaining this, but saying the same thing I am. It's the same basic graph, only he's got what I shared is the production and non-supervisory workers, which are about 80% of the private sector. It's like the bottom 80%. It takes out the high real wage earners, which can handle inflation better anyway. So it's really this slide is really looking at the bottom 80% that would theoretically struggle the most with inflation. He's got the all workers, and he's got the private worker, the production non-supervisory. So this is the production non-supervisory in red. And then you've got the all workers in blue, which aren't doing quite as well, but they're still right there. If you draw a mental line here from that tip of the blue line back, you're still a little better than right before the pandemic, and you're definitely better than 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. And then in red line is way above the pre-pandemic, about 3%. So this is the pros saying what I'm telling you. Also, when you do some comparisons, here's on the left-hand side, this is from the administration. This is from the Treasury Department. Really good article. I suggest if you need a sort of a shot in the arm, feel good, this is a good one. And they show that the lower the wages are of the workers, the better the gains they've had. So these are real wage growth, up 3.2% for the lowest, 25% at the median, meaning half are above and half are below, it's 1.7. And at the 75th percentile, it's still 1.1, still more purchasing power than 2019, despite inflation. Whenever you see that word real, it means inflation adjusted. People struggle with that. I see a lot of people saying 3% wage gain isn't all that much, blah, 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 when inflation was 20%. It's like, dude, that's what real means. Real means minus inflation, And then internationally, the U.S. is doing very well. Part of it is because we did this big Keynesian style stimulus, not just under Biden, but Trump too. Did very big stimulus, and we have recovered. Our wages have been growing better than other countries. So, and I could share slides like this too that show that our GDP has outgrown other countries in the recovery, and the same thing with inflation, that our inflation is actually lower than most other countries. So pause there, and inflation wages. Anything, Carl?
Now, the one thing I'm seeing from this is you mentioned that people think Republicans are better, and historically we've done some slides comparing economies under Republicans versus economies under Democrats that isn't specific to Biden and Trump. And I think we may need to revisit those and bring those back as well, because I think that helps make the case that long term, the economy is not good under Republicans.
Right. Yeah, when we go to the end of this presentation, there are links to different articles and sources. I have a thread on Twitter, for those of you that are on Twitter, that goes through all those slides. It's my pinned tweet. So you can always find it. If you're connected to me, it's always right there at the top of my page, right by my profile. You can't miss it. And then we have articles that are linked there as well. There's also a Wikipedia article on this, which I do check in on, and it's actually, there's enough people looking at it to where it's accurate at any given time. And it also has sources. There are a lot of different sources you can find that explain that the economy does much better under Democrats. And if you're really feeling adventurous, just do a search on Google and they'll all come up. I mean, it's all over the place. And there was a study done by no less than Alan Blinder, who was the Fed vice chair, did the main study on this, and he published it about halfway through the second Obama term. And so you've got, a NBER caliber paper that he published with these conclusions in it. And, it takes a little reading if you're going to study that, but that is the main study this is based on, is you got a top-notch economist that covered this. The data is there. It's simply Democrats don't echo it enough. You have to go back several years to find there was a presentation that the Senate Democrats did when they got the Blinder materials, and they published it like once. Like, guys, publish it weekly, every week. We don't understand the repetition that's required to get this stuff into people's brains. But if there was one thing that Biden could do between now and November that I would tell him to do, I would say, convince people of two things. The economy is better than 2019, and Democrats are better for the economy. If he said nothing else, because he's not going to get much in legislation. We got some stuff going on now with a little bit. It looks like maybe we'll get something with child tax credit, but all the noise is going to be on the border and some stuff in the Middle East and Ukraine. And if he just can focus on those two messages for his domestic agenda, get that into people's brains, he's also going to have a lot of help from one thing that's in our corner that is a huge win is the abortion issue. The vast majority of American women do not want men telling them whether they can have babies or not. And we've got to keep reminding people of that too, because that is a huge emotional issue that is in our favor. So that's our ace up our sleeve. As much fun as I like to talk about the economy, we have fun here in these sessions, putting all this stuff together. That's our ace, I think. All right. Some of these other economic statistics we throw into the trending stuff in this session. The Fed forecast as of December is throwing over 7. It's showing an unemployment rate that might climb as high as 4.1% over the next few years, which is historically very low. The historical average is 5.7%. So this is higher than 3.5, the 3.6, but it's not high in historical projections. The inflation comes down. That's what you want. And by the way, the Fed uses something called PCE inflation, and those numbers are looking good now, and they're going to be looking good going forward. And then we get the PCE information at the end of the month. That's one of the last things that comes out every month. We don't have that yet. I think it's the 26th of January when we get the PCE inflation. But that's the number the Fed looks at. We shared some slides on this a while ago about what's different about PCE inflation versus the sort of the CPI. It's mainly substitution. That you can, if the meat is expensive, you can substitute it for chicken. And hopefully chicken's cheaper. Not always, but I mean, generally it's the idea that you can substitute, which lowers the effective inflation that people feel. And so PCE inflation tends to run lower than the CPI. And that's what they're targeting. And they expect to get to that target in the next couple of years. But the interest rates will still be high for the next year or two. All Wall Street cares about, I shouldn't say all, but they sort of assuming the economy is going to be pretty good. They care about interest rates because asset prices move opposite interest rates. And if interest rates are going to be higher for longer, that's going to keep stocks from going up or cause stocks to go down. And that's what they watch is what's the trajectory for the interest rates. The Fed funds rate is there. That's the Wall Street game. That is not necessarily what's going on in Main Street. Now, some great news about stocks. Now, which usually say, and this is fair, people usually say, how much did the stocks grow in a year? That's kind of how they typically evaluate the different presidents. It grew about 13% or so under Trump and Obama. It was very similar, like into the tenths of decimal places on how fast the stock market grew under those two presidents. Almost identical. Biden had kind of an unusual situation where he had this giant increase from his election. He set the record for president in the first year from election, November to November, a 37% increase. The Bloomberg covered it and others because the stock market is a leading indicator, meaning that it reflects what the expectations of the future are today. And so it tells you what do people think is going to happen. And when Biden got elected, people knew that he was going to do a lot of good stuff, and he had a Democratic majority behind him that could get the stuff passed. And he did. And the stock market went through the roof. And it did that all the way until 2022, a little over a year after his inauguration, and it peaked. And then it started coming back down because the Fed started jacking up interest rates. That's no slight to Biden. He didn't do anything bad. And that's what happens when interest rates go up, stock prices go down. And now, as the expectation increases that interest rates are going to come down, you're seeing this number start to jump back up. And we got back to pretty much the all-time record with the S&P 500. And I think the NASDAQ is even beyond that now. But what you're seeing, though, when you look at this text here, if you average all the time that Biden's been president, what the stock market level was, and all the time that Trump was president, we are up almost 50% over that. So if you were to take the midpoint of Trump somewhere in here and the midpoint of Biden, sort of, Biden is way up. Your 401k is fine. If you were on track to retire under Trump, you're still on track to retire under Biden. The stocks are up 24% from Biden's inauguration and 42% from his election. That is very good. Nobody needs to complain about Biden being 3 years in and being 42% up. That's, what is that, 10% a year on average? So from election, he's doing fine. But yeah, people will complain about this, say, oh, stocks, I think probably Lowenstein did. Stocks did better under Trump, blah, blah, blah. It's like, you know what? I'll take my 50%. Thank you very much. Right? So is trying to tell the story, and so are several other liberal economists, that the stock market, I mean, not the stock market, the economy was hit by a supply shock, meaning people had all this money in their pockets, so demand stayed pretty solid, but they couldn't buy stuff. And they couldn't buy services, they couldn't buy goods. Prices jumped. And that's what, I'm not going to even go into all these fancy diagrams here he did, but I thought they were cool. If you're into this stuff, you can look at them. But what he said is the supply curve shifted in. It means other things equal, prices are going to go up. And now the supply curve is shifting back out. And so prices are falling. And in this case, not necessarily the prices are falling, gas prices have fallen from their peaks, but prices are just slowing down. They're not growing as fast. So Krugman's article, I don't know if I actually put his article, I should have put the article, it's from one of his newsletters, but easy enough to find. If you look, one of the best ways to learn about economics is to go to the New York Times and just go to Krugman's op-ed page and just start reading his op-eds. You can't get a better education about what's going on in the world than that. Now, some interesting things going on. You're probably all aware of Milton Friedman, who is a Nobel Prize winning economist, known as the Chicago School, very much a conservative economist by today's standards. Very famous quote from him, one of the most famous quotes in economics. Inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon in the sense that it is and can be produced only by a more rapid increase in the quantity of money than an output. Quantity of money is the money supply, output is GDP. So let's take a look at what has been happening with that since pre-pandemic here, the fourth quarter of 2019. The blue line is the money supply, that's called M2 in economics shorthand, up 36%, almost 37% since the fourth quarter of 2019. GDP up 6%, and the CPI is up about 18%. Milton Friedman, we're looking at this situation, he would say the Fed overdid it by expanding the money supply so fast. They didn't have to do that. They caused inflation, and now they're doing the right thing, which is they are actually cutting the money supply. The money supply has been falling right here. I'm going to show you a graph in a minute where we're going to drill down on that. That has almost never happened. The money supply tends to just go up, a little bit every year, sometimes a lot. When the economy hits like here, economy went up a lot. When the economy hits a recession, but then it's sort of just out there growing along with GDP. But lately, boom. And so he would look at this and be like, yep, doesn't surprise me you had inflation. And to him, the Fed is where it comes from. Like, it's not going to be because the government spent money. It's part of it, but it's mostly the Federal Reserve doing this. He did a very important research paper on the causes of the Great Depression, and he found that the reason, his argument was the Great Depression was caused by the Federal Reserve letting the money supply fall by a third, and maybe government more largely, not just the Fed, but allowing the money supply to fall by a third was a terrible error. So he's not always about cutting the money supply. In that case, you needed a bigger money supply. The blue line would have been well below the red line. That would have been a mistake. You want the two growing kind of in tandem together. And so the Fed, as fun as it is, like Carl will tell you sometimes, it's like, how much control does the president really have over the economy? It's much less fun to do these meetings if the president's got nothing to do with it. We always say, oh, this is Biden versus Trump or Democrats versus Republicans. It makes the parlor game more entertaining. But, the Fed is responsible for inflation. That's the bottom line. It is not the government's job to worry about it. If the government is going to do a giant stimulus program, it tells everybody, it's written in the law, everybody knows what's going to happen. The Fed can then adjust and say, well, if you're going to do that, I'm going to jack up interest rates. And the Fed in this case, and I think they did the right thing. They waited. They said, let's see how bad this pandemic is. And in fact, I think they did the right thing, which is the economy has recovered very well. Wages have kept up with inflation. So nobody, on average, the country is not suffering from inflation on average. Wages have kept up. And here we are. And now we're back to a reasonable, the inflation is falling back to target. I showed you the inflation expectations already there. And these inflation rates have been falling, and we're getting back to it. And the Fed is doing what they need to do, which is this blue line is coming down, and doesn't take a lot of that to take the wind out of the economy. Here is a detailed look at this. This is the money supply again. It peaked in July of 2022. You'll remember inflation versus a year ago, earlier peaked around that time. And since then, the money supply has fallen by about $1 trillion. This chart on the right shows that percent change in money supply versus a year ago. It has never been negative versus a year earlier, going back to 1960 actually. It got close to zero here in 93, but it never went negative versus a year earlier. You'll find like all these downs, they mean the money supply fell versus the prior month or versus a couple months earlier. But a sustained drop in the money supply never happened. Back 50 years hasn't happened. Here's just another way to look at it. You can think of, and there's a little math involved here, but this blue line, think of this as like the monetary push that's going into the economy. It's the money supply growing faster than GDP. So it's M2. This is a percent change versus a year earlier, M2 minus gross domestic product. So the blue line being positive means the Fed is sort of goosing the economy, and the blue line being negative would mean the Fed is pulling back. And so most of the time it's positive. And you had this giant positive here, but now you got a pretty sizable negative. The money supply is falling. The money supply versus a year ago, let's say if GDP was about, where was it last quarter, Carl? Was it 5%? 4.9? Let's use 5 as a round number.
Yeah, 4.9% was where it ended up.
That's for a quarter, but if you use 5% as a round number, and if this is negative 10, that would mean the money supply is falling 15%. Right around now. So the Fed is doing a lot to take juice out of the economy right now. That's, again, this is not typical. This is a more recent view of it, but this is a lot of gas being taken out of the economy. Conservative, this sort of formula now, before I show you the next slide, there's a lot of text on it. The idea is that fiscal policy, government, is spending money running these large deficits that Carl feared, about a 1.5 trillion. We ran 3 trillion deficits for a couple of years in the crisis. The government's running these big deficits. That's fiscal policy, putting a lot of juice into the economy, driving some of that inflation. At the other side, you got the Fed saying, okay, fine, that's what we're going to do. We are going to take money supply out and slow things down. And so what I'm showing on this slide is really kind of the goals of fiscal policy versus monetary policy. They're similar. One thing that's a little bit different about it, if you're in the government, is you're focused on jobs. So that's the key measure that everybody's looking at. You want to focus on jobs. And the Fed is worried about that too, but they're also worried about stable prices, keeping that inflation in that 2% range. Many times, the Fed chair has said, inflation is our responsibility. He says it in his speeches over and over and over again. Biden doesn't want to punt and say, it's not my job to worry about inflation. I'm worried about jobs, but that's a fair argument if he chose to make it. I'm the fiscal policy guy. They got to worry about inflation. That is not a crazy argument. He might not get away with it, but he's actually he's telling the truth if he does say that I did what I thought we had to do to keep the jobs going. Jobs are great. Recovery's on track. We're at full employment. The Fed can figure out the money supply, and that's their bailiwick to deal with inflation. He could have used that argument a long time ago, and it wouldn't shock me if Trump had used that argument. He would have said, "That's the Fed's job. That's not my job." Trump. He's not afraid to not take responsibility selectively, and we can learn from that. The man can market. The man is a marketing genius. I'll give him that. So here's who the owner is. The tools they use. I think everybody's familiar with the fiscal tools, the big spending, tax cuts to boost anything that adds to the deficits can boost it, or go the other way if you want to do austerity. And then regulation is another big one that the government can use to boost or slow down the economy depending on what their goals are. But the big one is the spending. Even tax cuts take a little longer and don't necessarily have as big a bang for the buck as the spending. They don't have as big a bang for the buck as the spending. The federal, the monetary policy tools are more complicated. This gets into the plumbing of how the Fed manages that federal funds interest rate. These first three guys here, interest on the reserve balances, overnight repo, discount rate, these are things that the Fed uses to control that key interest rate that you hear in the news all the time. That's the Fed funds rate. These things are used to manage the Fed funds rate. They can't just impose that rate. They have to manage it. That's why you hear them talk about the rate as being in a target range. They say the target range for the Fed funds rate has moved by a quarter, 25 basis points or whatever, They always talk about it in a 25 basis point range. They manage it through these techniques. I'm not prepared to explain every single one of them in detail here. I have to study each of these, but open market operations are where the Fed is buying and selling bonds, and they are right now a net seller, meaning they are selling bonds that the Fed owns. They're selling them to investors and taking money out of the system. That's how they take down the money supply. And also the last one is the reserve rate with banks. They can raise or lower that to tell banks you can only lend so much of the deposits that people give to you. So that's how they do it. And the measures you see, we talked about deficits earlier, definitely boosting the economy with large deficits and the money supply being lowered. They're cutting that down over the past year or so. They've been bringing that monetary supply down. So both, I joke that Keynes is this guy. It's not quite accurate because Keynes also was in the monetary supply too. But if you think of this as Keynesian and this is Friedman, that's not a crazy way to think about it. Both of those guys are about the two of the greatest minds of the 20th century, and they're both at work right now. All right, questions on that, Carl?
Not a lot. We had trying to get back to the chat, and it's disappeared from my screen, which makes life more fun. One of the things I would note in terms of what may end up hurting us in addition to the Suez and the Panama Canal, if we remember looking at oil production, U.S. oil production early in the Biden era, what we found was there was a dip in January of 2021 before it started going up regularly. And what that was when the Texas electrical grid failed during real cold weather. I've read at least one article in the last couple of days that indicates that Texas is telling their folks to go real easy on their use of power so the grid doesn't fail again.
Yep. Wear a sweater, people. Yep.
Well, they didn't like the regulation from the national grids, so they set up their own.
So to that point, now, and this gets back to the gas price thing too. I mean, as progressives, we want to see, we're probably willing to pay higher prices for gas because we want to see the country shift to renewables. We want to see solar and wind and some of us nuclear, things that are not putting carbon into the air. And so we have mixed feelings about record oil production. And I think Biden, I'm not sure that he's totally embraced this yet. I have to look a little more carefully. He may have done some slides on it more recently, but for the most part, he's been pretty quiet about the fact that the crude oil production is at record level. Maybe he thinks about it as MAGA's not going to care, and then his people can only get offended if you are, a serious climate person, and you wish that that production was down, and you wish that gas prices were higher, and you're willing to suffer through it and for that goal. But it is what it is. Here's where we are, Biden. We have record oil production, and I don't have the share slide here, but we shared I think it was last month, the share of crude oil production. The U.S. is the largest of the global producers. Now, we produce more than OPEC. People probably don't realize that. We are the world's big one. And one thing that, keep your eyes peeled for this kind of news, when you are fracking, you are using a tremendous amount of fresh water. And the New York Times has been warning now that some of our fresh water some of those aquifers are getting depleted significantly. So make no mistake, this is not a free lunch here. There is the carbon, there is the water usage for fracking. There are some negatives that go with this, but if we feel like fighting back against Republicans that are saying Biden is attacking the energy industry, it's like, really? If he is, he's doing a terrible job of it because he's got record energy production. But as you know, he's a practical guy. He wants to win the next election. He also has we passed the IRA, which has a tremendous amount of incentives for companies to go to clean energy, and the clean energy has been growing rapidly in the United States. It's going to take time to get away from fossil fuels. But in the myth busting, this is the myth busting section. Myth number one, Biden's attacking the energy industry, blah, blah, blah. And he's totally supporting the renewables industry, number one. And number two is we've got record crude production. Another one that we cover intermittently here is this idea that everybody's got to have multiple jobs to make it because inflation is so bad. This is a narrative that Republicans have been encouraging. And there's a new statistic that's floating around about a record number of people are working multiple jobs. The way that official data reports this, multiple job holders as a percent of the employed is very low historically. It's about 5%, a little bit below 2019. This is the annual average. If you look at the latest number, these numbers have been kind of looking like this. They popped up a little more. I think we're more like 5.3 now, so we're a little above 2019, but still, it's not high historically. And in fact, this economist, I can't remember his name right now, from CEPR, but he's made it pretty clear that multiple job holders are generally a sign of a good economy, not a bad economy, meaning people that want to make more money will take a second job and they can find it. As opposed to the idea that, everybody's poor and they need to work multiple jobs to stay afloat. It is just not that typical. There's not a lot of people. The anecdotes are strong and they're loud, but this is not a typical problem. It's not a problem. Even if it's higher, it's not a problem. I just would not look at this as a problem, but Republicans are trying to cast it as a problem. And some progressives on the left are I'm working 5 jobs to make ends meet, blah, blah, blah. And it's just like, well, exception, not the rule. Last of the myth busting here is the violent crime rate has been falling throughout the Biden administration. It fell in 2021. It fell in 2022. We don't have the full year FBI data yet. It takes a while for that to come through, like several months. I think it's like October, so you don't get it for a while, but there's anecdotes and some other sources that are coming out saying also in 2023 that some of the quarterly data is indicating that the violent crime rate is down. And the violent crime rate components are listed: murder, rape, robbery, aggravated assault. Standard FBI stuff, I didn't include or exclude anything. This is how they do it. You can find this right on their website, the FBI Crime Data Explorer, and it's all there. So the idea that the U.S. is a lawless wasteland like in the Road Warrior, Mad Max movies, Republicans would love us to believe that, but the fact is it was worse in 2020. And now you can't see it in this graph, but it is a hair below 2019. Like 2019 was like 380.8 or 380.9. It's like it's just a hair under 2019, but better is better. I guess one more myth, just for the climate stuff out there, is the world is heating up. It shouldn't be a big debate, but it is. That the science is pretty clear, and that's where we are. And the Earth, think of it like a fever. If you haven't dealt with this stuff before, it isn't that 1 degree. If your body temperature is a degree higher than it should be, that's bad. Something is wrong and is going on. Not that it's 1 degree out of 98.7, you're doing okay. It's bad. And so this number is rising. And it was the hottest year on record in 2023 through November. All right.
The other thing to remember is that they're talking about temperatures in Celsius. So 1 degree Celsius is 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit.
There you go. Thank you. That's true too. Yep, a little higher. So not a trend we want to continue because we don't know what's going to happen. It can change the oceans, not just melting ice cubes, icebergs, like people always think about. The water's going to rise 20 feet. What happens if something happens and the fish start dying a lot? We don't know, and a lot of people, it's going to kill off a lot of people if we can't feed ourselves, and we don't know what kind of weird things are going to happen if some of that frozen tundra that's got ancient bacteria and stuff frozen in there, if that opens up, and then there's all kinds of diseases we've got no immunity to coming out of there. So there's all kinds of terrible things that could happen. We just don't know, and be taking action to be prudent on that. So if you ask insurance companies, know that climate change is happening, and ask the people that keep getting their houses knocked down in Florida how they feel about it. I guess one more myth busting.
Insurance to rebuild.
Yeah, right. It's too expensive. They won't. It's not offered anymore. The insurance companies won't do it. And that's new. They used to offer insurance. So there's a lot of evidence out there. It's interesting. It's not an issue I dig into a lot. We have a separate climate group that probably gets into this a lot. But and let me go back here while we're talking about that. You get a lot of evidence out of corporations. Corporations are taking this very seriously and are, not just because of regulations, but also because it's costly for them, And so that's where you can kind of find a lot of data about how expensive are the costs. There was a good chart that I think the administration did a year ago or so. It was the number of like multi-billion-dollar or billion and up catastrophes per year, and it's been going much higher than it used to be. They're basically counting the hurricanes and the big floods and all the stuff that's happening in the U.S. and it's a much higher number than it used to be. Another myth I've been hearing a lot because it's hitting the left, the younger people that are progressives in the left, because housing prices are up so much. They're up about 12% in real terms. So if you were to add inflation to that since pre-pandemic, what's 12% plus 19%? Houses are up about 30-something percent. That's making housing unaffordable for young people. But keep things in perspective, 2/3 of households own the home they live in. About 80% of elderly do. And so housing price appreciation is good news for that group for the most part. For young people, if you look at this chart, the fourth quarter of 2019 and the third quarter of 2023, not only is home ownership up for everybody, it's up for every group, including the young people. It's only the 55 to 64s actually that have less home ownership. I don't know the reason why, but the young people are not the ones suffering. So again, perspective. Are these numbers down a little bit since 2022, 2021? Maybe. I think they are a little, not a lot, but they're up above 2019. So if you love the economy, in 2019, Trump sure did, Republicans sure loved it, you can't use this as a complaint. But you're hearing a lot of noise from progressives because housing prices are hard for them to afford. And, as the interest rates come down, that's going to help with cheaper mortgages. But housing prices are up and they are probably not going to fall anytime soon because we're just not building tons and tons of it the way we maybe did before. We've got a lot of supply problems in housing that we're trying to correct. And immigrants would be a wonderful source of labor to help us build that. And so, by spreading that needle too of even a lot of Democrats don't necessarily want a lot of immigrants coming into the country, but that's a great way to bring in workers, great way to help with bringing housing prices down because supply is not as expensive to build them. And you have also a lot more people paying into Social Security and Medicare to keep taxes down for the rest of us. Last but not least, important to understand about the economy. My spending is your income. Your spending is my income. The more people are here spending and consuming, the richer we get. And it doesn't happen right away like that. Obviously those first year that an immigrant comes here, they may be a net cost drain on us because we got to provide benefits for them. But after that, they start working, they start paying for themselves. All right, action. Last couple of slides. These are mostly recaps. I use this slide a lot. This shows you the 2019 annual average and the 2023 average. We don't have all the quarterly data in yet for 2023. We're still waiting for the fourth quarter GDP, for example. So then that's why the headers look different. But pick any measure on this page. They're all better in 2023 on average than 2019. And we've covered, I think, every measure on here. I think we hit them all. Oh, the uninsured we didn't talk about yet. Big decline in the uninsured from 2019 to 2023. Some of it started under Trump, but when Biden started, it was like 31 million something. So it's fallen under Biden for the most part down to this 25 number. That's the lowest it's been, number or percent, going back to sort of recent record keeping into the mid 90s. So that's a big achievement of his administration is the number of uninsured has been falling. It's still a lot. But a lot of those people actually now in that number are undocumented immigrants, somewhere around 10 million of that. Not 10, like 6 million, 7 million is because a lot of immigrants are here undocumented, have fake IDs, they have insurance. But the estimates are like 5 to 7 million of the uninsured are undocumented. Almost all the rest are citizens that just choose not to pay. They might, in some cases, they don't know that they're qualified for Medicaid or other services, which is the same. The outreach, just they're not resourced enough to find all those people. There's a lot of people going uninsured that it shouldn't have to be. But all good news there. This is, I always joke that this is Bill's favorite chart. Bill loves an old scorecard version of this that has some other measures on it, but this has the 2019 average versus 2023. So I pulled 4 of the measures out of the prior page and just put them in here. Job creation is faster. The hourly wages are higher. The real net worth is a lot higher for the bottom 50% group, almost 64% higher, and the S&P index is way higher. So this is, if you like this picture better than this picture, you got it. One other one is I've got 3 points of data here. So you've got, instead of being annual averages, these are points in time. So a quarter or a month, depending on the kind of measure. The pre-pandemic peak, so sort of Trump's best month here, like February 20 or Q4 19, versus when Biden took over, versus Biden's latest data. And out of 12 of these measures, these are 12 of the majors, 9 of them are better under Biden under either method of comparison. What you get, though, is see here, this is where a lot of the drama is. Real wages, 29.60 when Biden started, 29.42. There's a lot of damage being done with this comparison versus the longer comparison. And also on the net worth, it's less pronounced an increase because the net worth had already gone up a lot. Stocks tended to survive. They handled the pandemic very well. After that first drop, they came up and then they were at a near record level when Biden started. So not as big an increase in the net worth, and actually fell here. So this is where I think people, when they argue that things didn't get better under Biden, it's if they're looking at some of these numbers in here, and we just have to fight that to say that these numbers when Biden started, excuse me, if somebody says real wages are down by 18 cents, whoopee-doo, 14 million people more are working. The unemployment rate is way lower. So we can counter this stuff. Our strength is up here at the top, the labor market, and then this idea that real wages are down or people are hurting. That's where people are talking about this, but just keep in perspective. We shared the chart with you. Real wages are higher than they were in 2019, and they're really close to their all-time record. They're like 97th percentile overall. They're very high. This is not a good reason to be crying, because real wages are down 18 cents from when Biden started. They're extremely high. This number is distorted very much by all those people losing their jobs. It's not even a fair comparison. But if they want to do it, talk about this. 14 million more people working. That's a big deal. Stock market way up, and then the budget deficit here, of course, way lower than the first fiscal year when Biden came in because we're not doing all the pandemic support that was necessary. So if you're a deficit hawk, you're loving Biden. If you're an employment person, you're loving Biden. And if you want to argue about the finer points of 18 cents lower in real wages, then you go for it. And then here are some links for you. You can just click on these. Here's that Lal Brainerd year-end memo. There's a lot of good stuff in there. Why Republican presidents are so bad for the economy. You can read a New York Times article on that one that covers all the bases and gives you some links to some other studies on that. I do this chunk of this presentation is on Twitter at that link. I've done a comparison of Biden versus other presidents on Twitter. So you've got that. And then this overall thread, that's my main one that's, pinned, is at this link. Here's the Wikipedia article, U.S. economic performance under Democratic and Republican presidents. And then there's another article that needs a lot of work. It's the economic policy of the Joe Biden administration, covers a lot of the legislation and the benefits and things that he's delivered. If you need a litany of all the cool stuff that Biden's done, it's in there. Always a work in progress on that one, but the other article is pretty nice. Well, those are our prepared comments for this month. We're going to pause there and chat. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Just got a question from Joy about, wasn't there a program that helped cut child poverty in half that Biden let expire? Primarily, he couldn't get it through the Republican House, the renewal of those, although I think you mentioned earlier that may be part of the deal, allowing some of the Trump tax cuts to not expire, reinstituting some of the child tax cuts to help affect reduce child poverty.
Yep. And the child poverty was reduced. Was it 2021, Carl, that ran, or was it 2022?
I think it actually, a lot of that actually ran into 2023 and ended at the end of the last fiscal year.
Oh, okay. So longer than I thought. Okay. That's a correct statement that it did. The child tax credit dramatically reduced child poverty. And if we can get it through now, I have my doubts, mainly because as much as Republicans want the corporate tax cuts to extend and Democrats want the child tax credit, that would be in a normal year. I think you could get something like that done, but I don't know that they want to give Biden a win right going into the election. It's a lot easier for Republicans to stop him from getting anything good done. But just, and in general, it's easy to do this, and I've done it. We have to be careful about blaming Sinema and Manchin. We got to blame Republicans because Sinema and Manchin are just two people. If 2 or 4 or 5 Republican senators had helped the Democrats, we would have gotten a lot of that BBB stuff that was blocked. We would have gotten it through. You know, it's really, keep the blame where it belongs. It's almost never Biden's fault. He's always trying to get this stuff done. He's being blocked by Republicans and people that are helping Republicans.
See, I understand that the Senate is currently negotiating an additional child tax credit, and the Democratic senators are not entirely pleased with where they're coming out because it is substantially lower than the child tax credits in 2021. But they feel that getting something is better than nothing right now. The Republican senators are playing hardball. So they're likely to come out with some additional child tax credit, again, substantially reduced. Sadly, the current position is that it would not be made available to those who make less than a certain dollar of money. So it's not something that's going to be applied to those that are most marginalized, unfortunately. Yeah. So as a result of that, there are some Democratic progressive senators that are not pleased with that and are not signing on to it. But something may come out pretty soon on the child tax credit.
Thank you. That's a good summary. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I could add to that I heard today that the House leadership said that it's dead on arrival, so they're not going to pass it at all. They're not even going to bring the Senate legislation up for a vote.
I thought that was the most likely outcome. They're not going to let anything good happen while Biden is president. I mean, they are focused on power. And that's something that we also have to remind people of. You know, good stuff happens if you let Democrats do their thing.
Yeah. Well, we need to try and do a lot of this so that we need to keep the Senate, which is going to be difficult with Manchin and Sinema Manchin retiring and Sinema leaving the Democratic Party. And then the House, we need to regain the House so we can be in a position to pass legislation without worrying about Republicans. And so we need to keep both of those. And we need to remember that on judges, Manchin and Sinema supported Biden's judicial nominations. It helped us get a lot of decent judges confirmed.
And it's too bad that Manchin felt the need to be the hard case that he was on this stuff when he was planning to retire. Maybe he wasn't planning to retire and he changed his mind and decided maybe he'll run for president or something. Who knows? But the fact that he could have just been very progressive and then just left. And done a lot of good for people, and he chose not to do that. He may even still been Sinema might have been enough to stop it anyway. But if he was planning on retiring, then come on, get it done.
I don't think he was planning to retire because I think he was taking the positions he did so he get reelected in West Virginia, because progressive positions are not winners in West Virginia.
How so?
Notwithstanding that a lot of the residents of West Virginia need progressive policies and support from the government.
Sure. There were a couple comments in there about spreading this information. I mean, these slides, you can take and cut and paste any one of these slides, drop it into Facebook, go into Twitter, put it anywhere in Twitter where you are, or any of your social media accounts. You can email it to your friends. You guys have access to the presentation. You can spread this thing far and wide. You could cover a few of the bullet points with your senator or your House member. There's a ton of things you can do if you're passionate about this issue. And Carl and I have given you the tools you need. We go through this in an hour and a half or two, but you guys can read this stuff. there's questions, you can usually send them to me or Carl, and we'll answer them with more detail or links. If there's a subject in here you want to dig into, we can get you there. But you also have this great resource in this presentation to use. Just cut and paste it, cut and paste slides, and you can use the captions that are already on most of the slides and drop it into your Twitter or your social media, and you're good to go. So, amplify this stuff. Carl and I don't put our names on it. They don't say Dave and Carl at the bottom. We're trying to get the word out. We don't care that we get the credit. I mean, we don't. So get it out there.
Any
other questions or
tonight?
comments? Yeah. Stay warm, people.
Well, actually, that's an interesting point on the global warming issue. Is we're finding that electric vehicles don't like this weather.
Well, they drain energy quicker, but on the other hand, my mechanics would tell you that electronics like cold weather. It's just the battery storage goes down quicker. The electric vehicles do not like heat, and that the hot climate's a problem for them. But it's the battery storage thing. But there's some interesting developments coming in battery stuff. So maybe that'll get solved. I don't know, but obviously it's an issue, and it's these things are in early stages of development. So,
It's why I've commented that this is one technology I don't want to be on the bleeding edge of. So, just me.
All right. Do we want to adjourn, Carl?
We can certainly quit the recording, and then if anybody wants to stick around and talk about other stuff for a while, we can do that. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.